People often ask me when the desert finally broke me. They imagine a moment when I stood in the sand, looked at the empty horizon, and admitted defeat. But the truth is simple. The desert never broke me. It tested me every single day. My name doesn't matter as much as the place where I live, a land where the sun feels closer than the sky, where rain is only a memory passed from one generation to another, where the wind carries sand instead of promises. 10 years ago, this land was nothing but silence. No trees, no birds, no shade, only heat and doubt. When Steve Harvey came to visit me, he asked one question that stayed with me. How did you not lose faith in people? I smiled, because the real question was different. How could I lose faith when my entire family stood beside me with their hands in the dirt? This story is not about a miracle. It is about work. It is about patience. And it is about believing that even the harshest land can listen if you speak to it long enough. 10 years ago, I founded a small foundation. Not a famous one, not a wealthy one, just a promise to prove that the desert is not dead. It is only waiting. People told me I was crazy. They said you cannot grow trees here. They said you cannot fight nature. They said I would waste my life. But I was never trying to fight nature. I was trying to understand it. I grew up on this land. I knew how the ground cracked when it was thirsty. I knew how the wind changed before a storm that never arrived. I knew which plants survived and which ones surrendered. So we started small, very small. One tree, then another, then 10. We did not plant fragile trees brought from far away. We chose plants born for heat, roots designed to chase water deeper than hope. My wife planted beside me. My children planted beside me. Their hands were small. Their questions were big. Will this tree live? Will there be animals one day? Will the desert forgive us? I did not have answers, only faith. The first year was brutal. Most of the plants died. The sun showed no mercy. The soil rejected us. The nights were cold and filled with doubt. And yet every morning we returned. Because faith is not something you feel once. It is something you choose every day. Steve listened quietly as I told him this story. No jokes, no interruptions, only silence. The kind of silence that means someone understands. This did not happen overnight, I told him. It happened one root at a time. What people never see is the waiting, the years when nothing seems to change, when progress hides underground. But that is where the real work happens. Roots do not rush, they prepare. By the third year, something began to shift. The ground held moisture longer. The wind slowed. The soil grew darker. Life was negotiating its return. And that was the moment I realized something important. We were no longer just planting trees. We were rebuilding trust between humans and the land. This was only the beginning. The fourth year was the year of doubt. Not because nothing was growing, but because something was. Change is frightening when you have lived with emptiness for too long. The first signs were small, too small for anyone else to notice. A patch of ground that stayed cool after sunset. A shadow that lingered a little longer than it should have. Footprints of animals that had no reason to be there. At first, I thought my eyes were lying to me. Hope has a way of creating illusions. But the land was speaking back. Slowly, carefully. We expanded the foundation that year. Not with money, but with people. Neighbors, who once laughed at us, began to ask questions. Not skeptical ones, curious ones. What kind of trees are these? How deep do their roots go? How much water do they really need? I told them the truth. These plants do not need miracles. They need respect. We taught them how to collect morning dew, how to protect young roots from heat, how to let nature do most of the work. My children became teachers before they became adults. They spoke with confidence, dirt still under their fingernails. The desert watched. By the 5th year, the birds returned. Not flocks, just a few. But a few was everything. Birds do not negotiate. They do not believe in promises. They come only when life is real. That night, my wife cried quietly, not because of the birds, but because she finally allowed herself to believe this might work. The desert does not forgive easily. It remembers every mistake. We lost trees that year too, many of them. But something had changed. When one plant died, another survived nearby. The land was learning. So were we. By year 6, the air felt different, heavier, softer. The wind no longer screamed across empty ground. It moved through leaves. Leaves. That word still feels unreal. Children from nearby villages came to see the trees. They stood under shade for the first time in their lives. They did not ask questions. They just stood there. Sometimes silence is the most honest reaction. Steve walked with me through that shade. He ran his hand along the bark of a tree and stopped. "This tree is older than some of my TV shows," he said quietly. I laughed, but inside I felt something tighten, because this was no longer a project. It was history in the making. By the 7th year, insects arrived, then small animals, then seeds we did not plant. Life had started planting itself. That is when I understood the most important lesson of all. You cannot force nature to heal. You can only create conditions where healing becomes possible. The foundation grew, but I never allowed it to become about numbers. Not how many trees, not how many donors, not how many headlines. Only one question mattered. Is the land breathing again? By year 8, the answer was yes. The soil was alive, dark, rich. Water no longer vanished instantly. It stayed. It soaked. It waited. And so did we. The desert that once pushed us away was now holding us close. But the greatest test was still ahead. Because when success begins to show, faith is no longer about endurance. It becomes about responsibility. Year 9 was the most dangerous year of all. Not because the desert fought us, but because people started calling it a success. Success is loud. It attracts attention. And attention has weight. Journalists came first, then officials, then organizations with logos, plans and deadlines. They wanted numbers. They wanted speed. They wanted to know how fast the forest could grow if we pushed harder. I told them the same thing every time. This land does not respond to pressure. It responds to patience. Some listened, most did not. That year, we made our biggest mistake. We planted too much, too fast. We thought the land was ready. We thought we were ready. The desert corrected us. A heat wave arrived early, longer, stronger. Trees that had survived for years began to weaken. Leaves curled, roots struggled. My children asked fewer questions that season. They already knew the answers. Loss teaches quickly. We lost months of work in a matter of weeks. Entire sections turned silent again. And that night, for the first time in years, I wondered if we had gone too far. Steve called me after he left. He said, "People will cheer when you win, but they disappear when you slow down." He was right. Donations dropped. Cameras vanished. Silence returned. But this time, the silence felt familiar. Honest. So we slowed down. We removed signs. We stopped tours. We returned to the basics. My family and I worked alone again. Just like in the beginning. We listened. We observed where the land still felt strong, where moisture remained, where life refused to leave. We adjusted everything. Fewer trees, wider spacing, more respect. The desert responded almost immediately, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. By the end of that year, the damage had stopped spreading. New growth appeared near old roots. The land was not punishing us, it was teaching us restraint. That lesson changed everything. The foundation was rebuilt with one rule above all others. The land decides the pace. By year 10, we stopped calling it a project. It had become a relationship. People returned, but differently this time. Not to take photos, to learn. Farmers sat under trees we planted together years earlier. Children played where nothing once survived. And when Steve returned, he did not bring a crew. He brought time. We walked through the forest that used to be desert. No script, no performance, just footsteps on living ground. He stopped, looked around, and smiled. "This place believes in you," he said. I shook my head. "No," I told him, "we finally believed in it." And that is the truth. Faith was never about people alone. It was about learning to trust the quiet process of growth. The desert did not become a forest because we were strong. It became a forest because we stayed. When the land changes, people notice. But when people change, the land remembers. By the 11th year, the forest was no longer a secret. It could be seen from the road, from the hills, from places that once showed nothing but dust. Visitors arrived without invitations. Not officials, not journalists, families. They came with children, questions, and quiet disbelief. They walked slowly, as if afraid the trees might disappear if they moved too fast. Some of them touched the leaves, others touched the soil. A few simply closed their eyes and listened. Many had lived their entire lives believing this land was cursed, unchangeable, hopeless. Now it stood in front of them, breathing. We never told them what to believe. We showed them what was possible. Soon, small changes began beyond our borders. One family planted 5 trees near their home. Another dug shallow trenches to capture rainwater. A school asked if children could learn under shade instead of concrete. The desert did not transform all at once. It spread like an idea, slowly, quietly, without permission. The foundation stopped growing outward and started growing inward. We trained people instead of planting for them. Knowledge became our most valuable seed. We taught what failed as much as what succeeded. We spoke openly about mistakes, about years lost, about trees that never survived. People trusted us because we did not pretend to be perfect. By the 12th year, nearby landowners asked for help restoring their fields, not to make forests, but to make life possible again. Water tables stabilized, dust storms weakened, temperatures dropped just enough to be noticed. Science later confirmed what we already felt in our bones. The land was regulating itself. But long before data, there was proof. Children stopped coughing as much. Elders sat outside longer in the evenings. Animals returned paths that had been forgotten. One evening, my youngest son asked me a question I had waited years to hear. "Do you think the desert remembers what it used to be?" I thought about it for a long time. "No," I said. "I think it remembers what it can still become." That night, we heard frogs. Frogs, in a place where water once disappeared before touching the ground. I did not sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finally at peace. When Steve spoke about the project later, he did not call me a hero. He did not call it a miracle. He called it proof. Proof that people do not destroy because they want to. They destroy because they forget how to care. This forest was a reminder, not of what we saved, but of what we nearly lost. And that understanding carried a weight heavier than any failure. Because once people believe something can be healed, they are responsible for how they treat it next. The forest did not just change the land, it changed the way people looked at time. Before, everything had to be fast. Fast results, fast profit, fast proof that effort was worth it. But trees do not hurry, and neither does healing. People who visited expected answers, instructions, a formula they could copy. Instead, they left with questions. What if progress is not visible every year? What if growth happens where no one is looking? What if patience is not weakness, but skill? I watched grown men stand under shade and grow quiet, not because they were emotional, but because something inside them slowed down. The forest asked nothing from them, and that made them uncomfortable. We are used to places that demand work, payment, attention. This place simply existed, and that existence felt honest. My family noticed the change in me as well. I spoke less. I listened more. The land had trained me, not to control, but to respond. Every decision now began with observation, not ambition. Should we plant here? Or should we wait? Is this growth natural or forced? The answers were never dramatic. They were quiet, and quiet answers require humility. That humility became the foundation's true purpose, not reforestation, relearning restraint. I began telling visitors something they did not expect. You don't need to start a forest, I said. You need to start paying attention. Pay attention to soil, to wind, to water, to how long things actually take. Some people left disappointed. They wanted action. Others stayed. Those were the ones who understood. Because this place was never meant to impress. It was meant to endure. Steve understood that immediately. On his second visit, he spent most of the day sitting under one tree. No cameras, no audience. Later, he said something that stayed with me. This forest makes people honest, he said. They can't pretend they built it quickly. He was right. There is no shortcut visible here. Every tree carries its years openly, and so do we. The forest became a mirror. It showed people what long-term commitment actually looks like. Not exciting, not glamorous, just consistent. And consistency, I learned, is the rarest form of faith. Every long journey has a moment when exhaustion becomes invisible. You keep moving, you keep working, but something inside begins to thin. For me, that moment came quietly, not during a failure, not after a storm or a loss. It came during success. The forest was stable, the foundation was respected, people trusted us, and yet I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. I realized that for years I had been strong on purpose, strong for my family, strong for the land, strong for everyone watching. But strength, when held too long, becomes heavy. One morning, I stayed home. For the first time in years, I did not go to the trees. The forest survived without me. That thought frightened me more than any drought. If the land no longer needed me, who was I without it? I did not speak about this to anyone, not to my wife, not to my children. Instead, I worked more. I answered messages, I planned trainings, I spoke at meetings, and the further I moved from the soil, the further I moved from myself. My wife noticed first. You don't touch the trees anymore, she said. She was right. I talked about them. I protected them. But I no longer listened. The forest had taught me patience. Now it was teaching me limits. One evening, my oldest child asked me a simple question. Who takes care of you? I did not have an answer. That night, I walked alone into the forest. No tools, no plans, just my feet on the ground. I sat under the first tree we ever planted, the one we thought would never survive. It was tall now, strong, unapologetically alive. I realized something important in that moment. The forest was never meant to depend on me forever. If it did, we had failed. Success meant letting go. The land had matured, and so had my role. The next morning, I stepped back. Not away, just aside. I trusted my family. I trusted the community. I trusted the systems we had built slowly. And for the first time in years, I rested without guilt. The forest did not collapse. It breathed, and so did I. That was when I understood that faith is not proven by holding on, but by knowing when it is safe to release control. Stepping aside did not mean disappearing. It meant watching others step forward. At first, they moved carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile. But the forest was no longer fragile. It had learned how to stand. My children took on responsibilities naturally, not because I asked them to, but because this place had always been part of their lives. They knew the rhythms. They knew which areas needed rest. They knew when not to interfere. The community followed. Decisions were no longer filtered through one voice. They were discussed under trees, with shade overhead and soil beneath feet. Arguments softened here. It is difficult to shout in a place that took decades to answer quietly. The foundation stopped being mine in any meaningful way, and that was its greatest success. People protected what they felt ownership over, not legal ownership, emotional ownership. When a tree was damaged, someone noticed before we did. When water channels clogged, they were cleared without meetings or instructions. The land had caretakers now, not leaders. I began to understand legacy differently. Legacy is not what remains with your name attached. It is what continues when your name is forgotten. One day, I overheard a child explaining the forest to a visitor. She spoke with confidence, as if this place had always existed. She did not mention me, or the foundation. She talked about the trees, about shade, about birds. I smiled. That was the goal all along. Steve sent me a message after seeing that moment. "This is what faith looks like when it grows up," he wrote. I kept that sentence, because faith, like forests, should outgrow their founders. The desert had not just accepted life, it had learned to defend it. And that meant our work was finally honest. By the 13th year, the forest had a voice of its own. Not a literal voice, but a presence that demanded respect. Scientists came, journalists came, visitors came, and each of them left changed. Not because they understood every technique or every rule, but because they felt what patience, care, and faith can create. The desert, once indifferent, had become a teacher. It taught those who listened that destruction is easier than creation, and that the work that takes decades is often invisible to the impatient eye. Steve came again. This time, he stayed for a week. We walked every path, every section of shade and sunlight. We touched the trunks of trees that had survived droughts, floods, and neglect. He asked me why I had kept faith for so long. I told him the truth. I did not keep faith for myself. I kept it for everyone else. For the people who had forgotten how to wait. For the children who had never seen life grow where they thought it impossible. For anyone who doubted that humans could repair what they had harmed. By that point, I realized the forest was doing more than feeding the land. It was feeding the soul of a community. It was giving hope in a place that once had none. Farmers nearby began experimenting with crops adapted to the new soil. Families planted small gardens at their homes. Children learned lessons about life under trees instead of only in books. The forest was multiplying its impact, not with force, but with example. And the most remarkable part, No one claimed credit. No one argued over ownership. It became clear that when people see life nurtured carefully, they start nurturing it themselves. I began to understand that faith is contagious, not the faith that demands attention, but the quiet, persistent faith that insists on showing up every day. By now, Steve understood completely. He told me, "You didn't just plant trees, you planted belief in people." And in that statement, I finally recognized the truth I had been chasing for a decade. The desert had not only forgiven us, it had taught us how to forgive ourselves. And perhaps more importantly, it had shown that people, when given a chance and guided patiently, can become as resilient as the land itself. By the 14th year, the forest was no longer surprising. It had become expected, its presence ordinary. And yet, every time I walked its paths, I felt awe. Visitors would arrive early in the morning, hoping to capture the first light on leaves that had once been sand. They whispered as if speaking too loudly would disturb life itself. The air smelled different here, fresh, moist, alive. Children ran freely through the shadows of trees that were taller than their homes. Birds nested without fear. Animals appeared that no one had seen for decades. I watched families sit on the ground, letting the sun touch their faces, and realized something profound. This forest was teaching people patience. It was teaching them respect. It was teaching them humility. Steve returned again for the final visit of that year. He walked quietly beside me. We did not talk much. Words were unnecessary. Finally, he stopped near a grove of trees planted on our first day together. He ran his hands over the bark and said, "Look at this. This is life. This is hope. And this is faith." I nodded, because it had taken years to understand that faith is not something you say, it is something you live. The families that had come to help plant trees years ago now taught their children how to care for them. Neighbors who once doubted now guided newcomers, and the forest, it grew steadily, patiently, without need for applause. At that moment, I understood the greatest truth of all. We did not plant this forest for fame. We did not plant it for money. We planted it for belief that humans could create beauty where none existed, that we could learn from the land instead of conquering it. And the land responded, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with life. I felt tears on my cheeks, not sadness, but gratitude. Gratitude for the desert that never gave up on us. Gratitude for the family that stayed. Gratitude for every person who decided to see potential instead of despair. Steve stood silently beside me, as if he knew words could not contain the moment. He looked out across the forest and said, "This is the kind of story people need to remember. Not the easy ones, the ones that take everything and give it back tenfold." And he was right. This forest is more than trees. It is more than soil. It is more than years of labor. It is a testament to what people can achieve when they refuse to lose faith. Now, looking back over more than a decade, I see the forest not just as a place, but as a journey. It began with a single tree. It grew through failures, doubts, and moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. It survived because we stayed, because my family stayed, because people refused to believe that the desert was permanent. Steve Harvey came, watched, and learned what so many still forget. Faith is not blind optimism. It is the courage to act day after day, even when success is invisible. And the forest speaks this truth louder than any words. It tells children that care matters. It tells neighbors that patience is strength. It tells all who visit that humans are capable of creating life where none existed before. I often think of those first years, when the sun burned endlessly, when the soil refused water, when doubt whispered in every corner. I remember the tears, the failures, the sleepless nights, and I realize now that every hardship was teaching us the same lesson. Life returns to those who nurture it. Hope returns to those who refuse to give up. The forest will continue to grow long after I am gone. It will continue to teach and inspire, not because of me, but because people chose to believe in what seemed impossible. Steve told me once that people forget the quiet victories. They celebrate noise, applause, and instant results. But he reminded me that the most important victories are the ones no one notices at first. This forest is a victory, not for me, not for Steve, not for any foundation or organization. It is a victory for faith, for patience, for belief in humanity. And when people come here, they feel it. They feel the power of consistency, the strength of dedication, the quiet, unstoppable force of hope. I did not plant this forest to be remembered. I planted it to remember that people can choose to care, to remember that the impossible is only impossible until someone decides to try. Steve Harvey saw it, the families see it, and now the world can see it too. Because this is more than a forest. It is proof. Proof that humans, when they refuse to give up on each other or on the world around them, can change even the harshest desert into life itself. And that, in the end, is all anyone needs to believe in.